Hello there. It's been a while. Since I made new content. I'm not sure if it's like illegal or something to post a wrap up for a month, 1 month later. As in like this is my August wrap up even though September is ending. But basically the end of August and the beginning of September were just kind of nuts for me and I didn't have book tubing time, although I did read actually a lot in August, which is why I really wanted to make this. In August, I had two goals. There was the Women in Translation Month goal, and then I want to read some spooky things because in Japan, August is like spooky time. I wanted to combine those if possible, but I couldn't find any books that like were both written by women and translated into English, and scary. So, well, scary in the kind of fun, spooky way that I wanted. Basically, what I did was I had two different groups, and it ended up being that the scary things were all audiobooks and the physical books were all women in translation books. For the women in translation goal, I read 8 short stories, 3 books, and a handful of comic strips. And for the spooky month goal, I listened to 2 short stories and 2 books. So in total, for the month of August, that's 10 short stories, 5 books, and a handful of comic strips. Now, of those books, one was a novella, one was a children's book, one was an old diary. So like, I really think that the most of the texts were all short, and that's why I was able to get through what was for me like a large amount of text. I had a really fun time as well having this women in translation challenge because there's so many books that I want to read, and sometimes like knowing where to begin and all the books on my shelf is kind of like oppressive. And like also I guess I know very well the books that I'm going to read next because they're on my shelf. So having this chance to just drop my reading list and go into the library and see what they have in terms of women translated into English was really exciting because it was just like, being introduced to a whole bunch of books that weren't on my reading list and that, like I wouldn't have found otherwise, or I wouldn't have read immediately otherwise at least. And looking for the books was actually a really interesting experience because, it's not like in the library catalog or anything. So I just went to the shelves and was looking for names that sounded kind of not Anglophone and not masculine. So it's obviously a really haphazard way of trying to find things. And also, like, some of them I knew, like Elena Ferranti, I knew, apart from the fact that her name fits those requirements. But still, like, there were some writers that I knew and other ones that I didn't. But in any case, like, it was a really kind of interesting experience, like having to go through the shelves like that, looking for this specific type of book rather than looking for like a book that I was interested in or a writer I was interested in or just browsing in general. So that was really fun. Anyway, let's get on to the books. To begin with, I want to give an honorary mention to Tokyo Ueno Station because while I technically did finish this in August, I didn't include it in that previous list because I read it almost entirely in July, and for me it's definitely a July book, and I've already talked about it on this channel in my July video, which I'll link somewhere up there or up there. All the short stories I read were from this book that I own by Clarice Lispector. I'd already read 2 from the beginning bit called First Stories, so it was sort of just finishing out this next bit, and the way they've done it is they've ordered it chronologically, or as chronologically as they can. So these were like stories that she did when she was very young, and it calls them, like somewhere in the back it says they're juvenilia, and sometimes they kind of felt that way. Like some of the writing is really brilliant, but it also feels like kind of unrefined and like kind of like sketches and story ideas that don't really amount to much. Probably my favorite story was called Jimmy and I, and it was just like 4 pages, and it felt like it was a story, like had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's about a woman who is in love with a guy, and he's got these kind of concepts about love, and that love is the most pure thing, and if you love someone you should just be with that person and forget everything else, and all this society and civilization has kind of stifled that pure animal like necessary like desire to live and love. And so she kind of like is interested in his ideas, and she never heard stuff like this before. She becomes almost like a disciple, like when she enters into the relationship with him, and that's like a kind of a recurring theme. Young women getting into relationships and like having their horizons like expanded by the man that they're with, and like kind of having a new sense of selfhood and like way of conceptualizing the world. But then she just obviously meets another guy and then stays true to the philosophy and dumps the first guy. And the first guy is like, "What are you doing? You didn't understand anything I taught you." And she's like, "No, I'm just dropping the civilization stuff, like you said." So, yeah, a lot of these stories are like kind of feminist in that way, but it's really interesting that they do this heterosexual relationship, which always begins from quite a patriarchal point of view, where the man is the teacher and the woman is the student. But then, the woman kind of uses those teachings to gain a level of selfhood where she no longer needs the man, and she kind of builds her own life. So I really like that. It does feel like it's going to get better as I get more into this gigantic book. But I'm going to put it down for now. I'm going to kind of leave it alone. I was happy to finish that first chunk, and then now I can just move on into the next stuff. Next up was Sazae-san. I didn't really read much of this. These are comics. I only read that much. These are like comics in English and Japanese, originally in Japanese. And I went to the doctor and was reading it in the reception room and got through a whole bunch of them, and then just never went back to it. It was perfect for like kind of waiting in a reception room kind of reading, but I didn't feel compelled to go back when I could be reading one of my other books. So yeah, I mean, I want to get through them more, but like, yeah, that was the handful of comics. Hello there, I'm back. I went to go see a friend who was visiting from Tokyo, and now I'm back and it is dark, so I'm using this light. So the next book is The Diary of Izumi Shikibu, which is in this book of Japanese diaries. Now, this book begins where the lady who is the protagonist, who we know as Izumi Shikibu, is in mourning because her lover is dead, and she's describing her garden and everything is a world of grief, and there's all these descriptions of like the plants and so on. And then the page of her dead lover comes to visit, and she's like, "Why haven't you been visiting me? I've been lonely." And he says, "Yeah, well, I'm just a page, so it'd be a bit weird if I came to visit you, because it would seem a bit like forward, but I have wanted to see you, because they're friends, obviously, because he used to go between her and her ex-lover." And he says, "Now I'm working for his younger brother, so I have an excuse to see you." And when I said that I was going to see you, in fact, he said, "Oh, why don't you give her some flowers?" And he gave me these orange blossoms. "So here you go, here's some orange blossoms from that guy." And she's like, "Oh, wow, I'm surprised. I thought he's got a reputation for being really like kind of dignified and stuffy and like, uptight." So she's surprised by the flowers, and they kind of remind her also of her dead lover. And so she writes a poem, as people did, as aristocratic people did in the Heian period in Japan, as a way to show thanks. So here's the poem. "Rather than recall the fragrance of the bygone orange blossoms, oh, you wood thrush, I should like to hear your singing to determine if your voice is also true." I get to this, I'm like on the second page, and I'm like, damn girl, she's just moving in there. It's not just one person, like it takes two to tango. And the prince, like moving on from the orange blossoms, responds to this poem with, "When the wood thrush can acquaint you with its singing on the accustomed bough, you will discover that its voice speaks with unvaried truth." This guy's brother is barely in the ground, the soil is still fresh. I mean, you read this and you think Hamlet had nothing to complain about at all. It's been a really short time. I don't know in the Heian period, like if people had much shorter life expectancies, but I guess they must have, because these people move fast. Also, like in that whole opening section, apart from like the juiciness, I really like the way that the page is used as a kind of plot device, because the way he speaks, he sounds really normal and like a friend. And it's a realistic way that she could get connected to the younger brother as well, and also like allows for some characterization for her, like the fact that she's upset with the page because he hasn't come to see her. Well, so she's both upset with him and also happy to see him at the same time, and that kind of sets us up for what's going to happen next. And the thing I like most about this, and this is just the first 2 pages, right, is the disjuncts between the prose and the poetry, because the prose is quite like formal, and it sounds like this is all just normal, the way that they're doing things, she's in mourning, the brother is also in mourning, so they're exchanging these formalities, but in a pleasant way, because obviously they both know that they're deeply connected to the person who died. But then when you read the poems, they're steamy. I mean, maybe not steamy, like as steamy as a wood thrush can be, but seriously, like they're already coming up with little pet names and like cutesy animal names for each other. The real life Izumi Shikibu was known both for being one of the greatest, if not the greatest poet of her time, and also for being a bit of a hoe. So it's like true to character. The thing that I tried to read this ages ago, right? And I gave up on it. And I think the reason was because I read it in little bits. And I read it in little bits, and every time I read a little bit, I kind of felt like, what? Didn't I just read this? Like, they're in love and they're angsty, and like one of them saying, oh, I love you, but you make me suffer. And then there's another poem coming back saying, no, I suffer much more because of you. Every time the plot starts to go somewhere, then, like, oh, maybe we should move in together. And then, there's like 5 pages and it's like, nah, we really shouldn't move in together. And it just doesn't go anywhere. And it's not about the plot. The most plot that you get in the shortest space of time is those 2 pages that I just described to you. The rest is just the love story between her and the younger brother. And it's not a love story, really. Firstly, because there's not much of a story. And secondly, because their love is really, like, toxic. For him, he's a much higher status than her. So, if the rumors continue to circulate about them, then it makes him look bad. And for her, she's like a woman being frivolous with a man, like in no official capacity. So obviously that's got like a really negative connotation for her. For her, she's a hoe, right? Point is that they both risk their reputations and they both constantly doubt their partner, and they're really proud and arrogant and miserable, sensitive, poetic. They've got these things in common. And that's why it's just really fun to read. Basically, they're dicks to each other consistently. But the lady is less of a dick, and she's actually really interesting and the better poet. I love how they never say that she's a better poet in any way in the text. Just by reading the poetry itself, you can see her poems are better than his poems. Like, his poems tend to be like asking practical questions, like, why didn't you see me last night? Or I came and nobody opened the door, what's going on? But with some nature imagery or whatever. And her ones, she like takes the images from his poems and recycles them to like say something kind of like conceptual. And like she answers his question like, why didn't I open the door or something? But she also makes it like actually have some sort of resonance. And basically she's just a better artist. And I love that these poems are in the diary. And I don't know if they are like collected from an actual correspondence or if they're all kind of fictionalized versions of what this real life correspondence was. Also, this book is pretty steamy. Like, I mean, as steamy, I guess, as Heian period literature can be. Like, this was written like about 1,000 years ago. So, you got to give it a bit of leeway. But still, there's these moments where, he reads his poem to her and then she comes up with a reply which is so good and so aesthetically pleasing about the moon or something. And he's just got, his heart goes aflutter and he rushes to her side. And then it says, they spend some time together until dawn. And that's going all the way through. So it's just like kind of sex and then distance and then sending poems back and forth. It's just psychological. It's like a real interesting psychology of love between these 2 characters. And it's just pretty, and I liked it a lot, as in case you couldn't tell. The next one is The Vegetarian by Kang. When I went into this, I think all that I knew was that it's about a Korean woman who becomes a vegetarian, and because of that, she meets a lot of resistance and has a lot of problems from and with her husband and her family. And so I guess I had this image of like it's going to be sort of feminist and, involved in examining Korean society maybe, and I don't know. I didn't have much of an opinion going into it. And it's not about that. I mean, like, that's all true, but it's kind of more about following desires at the cost of living a stable life. You know what I mean? So, like, that includes vegetarianism, but it also includes cheating on your partner. And it also includes, for example, like, having sex and not caring about the other person's consent. And it includes, like, a lot of things. It's a very broad kind of thing, like, just following a certain desire for yourself and, not caring about the consequences on other people or on your standing in society. But it works, like those themes kind of like all come together despite the fact that they're so disparate, because they're also connected to other ideas like about mental health and the self-destructive impulse that all people have to some degree or another, or especially the people in this novel. Also, how difficult it is to find like meaningful things in a world which is basically abusive and intolerant, where people are just involved in their own stuff, and also just how men are shit. Like, that's a message which I feel like came across pretty strong in the book. And all these thoughts and feelings are basically things that chime with me and that I agree with and that I've felt and that I try not to think about, to just enjoy my life as much as possible. And this book just threw them in my face, and it was horrible. I mean, the book was good, but the experience of reading it was not a pleasant one. Let's put it that way. So like this book was like one of the first times maybe the first time ever that I feel the Goodreads rating system completely failed me. If it was like based on impact, like how much of an impact it had on me, obviously it would be 5 stars, but you know, based on how much I enjoyed reading the book, that would be minus 100 stars. Now that there's been a bit of time between me and the book, I can kind of like appreciate it more and appreciate what was going on and what Kang was doing. And like, I do think it's really cleverly put together, especially because it's so short. I love short things which can do a lot and like don't waste any space. It's hard to say that I gained anything really valuable though from reading this, or that I learned anything from it, except that maybe like a book like this exists, because I don't think I'd read a book that like really cut me to the core like this before. And yeah, it's still kind of under my skin, and I might do a review about it later or something, just to try and exercise it away from me. It's like when you see a violent image or you hear a terrible story on the news and it just stays like around your retinas and you can't get rid of it, and even when you forget about it, it's kind of still there and then comes back again. That's kind of like what this book was like for me. It's not really like haunting my dreams or anything like that, but you know, it kind of stuck like a thorn in my head, and like I can't quite get rid of it yet. So yeah, I might do a review on this one. We'll see. Largely because of the vegetarian, I paused reading this one, Beauty in Disarray, but I want to mention it because I did spend a lot of time reading it in August. I needed something to really kind of cheer me up, and I'm really glad that I stopped it, because now I'm reading it again and I can see that the format of this book is actually really similar to the vegetarian, in that like there's these large sections which are seen from the fictionalized point of view of a character who is deeply involved with the main character, but the main character's voice is never heard, at least so far. And also the first one of those huge sections is from the point of view of quite an unpleasant man who's quite selfish and ends up in a sexual relationship with this girl who he doesn't really care about and sees her as like kind of a drag. And anyway, I'm loving this book at the moment, but I'm glad I didn't read it straight after the vegetarian. Instead, what I did read was The Moomins and the Great Flood, and this was fantastic. This was absolute new favorite for me, definitely one of my all-time favorite children's books, and I talked a lot about it in my vlog, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here. Basically though, you might think that because the vegetarian was like about real shit and Moomins are like fantasy shit, it was like yay, an escape from all that horrible real life stuff into a magical thing. But the reason that this was so like kind of cleansing and like an antidote to the vegetarian for me was precisely because it's dark. It's got like this undercurrent of like fear and danger, because the Moomins are like moving from swamp to mountain to flood to try and like, you know, find a place where they can make a home. It's actually got like all these haunting images in it, but there's always the sense that you're kind of safe. You're in a fairy tale. It's gonna work out, you know. There's not something horrible isn't about to happen, you know. Like things will, you're gonna get that happy ending. You know you're gonna get that happy ending. So that feeling of like safety and hopefulness, despite the fact that there's horrible things in the world, was exactly what I needed. Not just some like kind of fluffy escape to Moomin Land thing. So that's why this book was amazing, and why I mean, even if I'd read it at any point, I would have loved it, let's be honest. If you want to hear me gush about it, then check out the vlog, because I talked about it a lot. I moved the light just because, why not move the light? So, we are now on to the scary bits, the spooky season. This summer has had a lot of firsts for me, because I had my first ebook in July, and then my first audiobooks in August. So, yeah, I'm discovering a lot in the world of reading. The Wendigo, this was the first one. I was really ill and I couldn't read or watch movies or do anything. I just wanted to like sit down and close my eyes and listen to a human voice. So I found this audiobook. I wanted to, you know, just find something that was free and in the public domain. And there was one called The Wendigo. And I really have loved Wendigos ever since I played this video game where Wendigos feature heavily with one of my best friends, and we made lots of jokes, and it was just really fun. And Wendigos are like, they were portrayed really well in that game, in my opinion. For those who don't know, it's like a Native American folkloric creature. There's one version of the story, which isn't in this story that I read, where cannibalism is a big part of it. If you go out in the wilderness and you eat human flesh because you're starving, the spirit of the Wendigo can infest you and like make you become a Wendigo yourself. So anyway, it's a lot to do with possession and also like some primeval creature from Native American legend. This story is about an American or Canadian, I forget, hunting party, and they go out into the wide expanse, and there's all the descriptions of the big lakes and the mountains, and this sense that there's all these hidden places still in the world, and that nature is huge and vast and terrifying and sublime, and there's something in there that's going to get us. And that was exciting and fun. But unfortunately, it doesn't really go anywhere beyond that. The thing I liked about this, I guess, is that I could see how it was a precursor to H.P. Lovecraft, who I've read a few things of and I like. And yeah, like H.P. Lovecraft does a similar kind of setup, but a much better execution. So I kind of felt this is what shaped H.P. Lovecraft's writing. He like did this, but better. In this one, like when the Wendigo actually appears, when the hunter and the little group actually have their scary encounters, it's kind of like it goes back to instead of this scary, unknowable, terrifying nature thing, it becomes like kind of silly and like folklorish, and the Wendigo, like, I don't want to say exactly what happens, but it's not scary and it's not even like shocking or weird. It's just like, that's a Wendigo? That's a Wendigo? It was fun. It wasn't too long, but it wasn't great. It wasn't awful. It was exactly what I needed at the time, and it was really nice just to have a story, even if it wasn't the best story in the world, to help me through that illness. But I'm still left really wanting to experience some great Wendigo fiction, because so far I've only had that video game. So if anybody knows a great book about Wendigos or that features Wendigos, please send me a message or something, because I need more Wendigos in my life. The next thing I listened to was the short story called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. This is like set in a village in America. It's the day of the lottery, and it's not said exactly what the lottery is. That's like the main tension in the story. We're waiting to find out what exactly is the lottery. So everyone from the village is lining up. There's some sort of ritual thing where they all put their names in a hat or something, and somebody gets called out of the hat. There's a increasing sense of unease as it goes on, but for the most part it's not scary, but you kind of feel something not good is going to happen once the person who wins the lottery or is chosen by the lottery. I don't know why I did this. Once the lottery is done, something awful is going to happen, and it does. And it was a good story. It wasn't amazing, and it was written when I finished it. I looked to see when it was written, and it was written in the post-war period, like after World War II. And then I was just like, now I get it. Because yeah, it's got like kind of not Nazi vibes, but like the whole authoritarian regime thing, and following how a group of people can end up doing monstrous things if they just kind of work as a group and follow tradition, and nobody ever stands up and says no and all this stuff to authority figures and people who just carry on things for the sake of carrying them on. And that's how evil happens. So it was interesting in that sort of social parable kind of way, but it wasn't super cool. I liked the Wicker Man vibes. It had really strong Wicker Man vibes, and I love the Wicker Man, the movie, the original, obviously. Great film, and I love that kind of folk horror stuff. So that was the best part of it, really. The next thing I listened to was The Fall of the House of Usher, a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, which I had always meant to read at some point, and I never did. I like Edgar Allan Poe. I've read a lot of his stuff, and I expected I would like this, and I did. I really loved it. So the story is there's this guy, and he gets a letter, and the letter is from someone he went to school with called Roderick Usher, and they weren't particularly close or anything, but like maybe he was a bit more friendly to him than other people were. And this letter basically explains how Roderick Usher is very ill. He's not well, and he wants companionship. He wants somebody to just sort of take care of him and be with him during a really difficult time in his life. And the narrator is a nice guy, and so he just drops he says that he's dropped everything he was doing and decided this poor guy probably doesn't have any friends if he's calling out to me, who barely knows him. So I'll go to his creepy mansion where he lives with his creepy sister, and I'll see what I can do to cheer him up. I love that premise because it is like a terrifying mansion and there's all the sense of foreboding and stuff. But I love that the narrator is just doing it out of the niceness of his heart. The things that he does to try and cheer up Roderick are so cute and so fun. Roderick is basically like a Tim Burton character. He's like the proto Tim Burton character where he's, his skin is sallow and he's got like the tousled hair. He's described as looking like an opium addict, morose, melancholy. What the narrator does to try and cheer him up is like, first they do some painting and then like, let's do some painting. And Roderick ends up painting something like monstrous and hellish, and the narrator is just like, okay, well, we don't have to do that. How about music? We'll do some music. They take out instruments, they start playing the instruments together, and straight away Roderick starts playing this terrifying thing in a minor key, and then he suddenly starts singing, and he's singing a song about an ancient king who was like killed by his subjects or something, I don't know. Anyway, but then the narrator is like, okay, you know what, let's stop the music. Do you have any books? Why don't we read some of your books? So they go to the library and they take out the books, and the books are all gothic, and the books are all about, I don't know, like strange supernatural things. And Roderick talks about his theories about how his house and his family line are connected to each other, so that like the blood of the House of Usher and then the physical House of Usher have some sort of like supernatural connection just from having been in proximity for so long. Like his family line and the actual physical house itself have become somehow unnaturally and unhealthily intermingled with each other. And anyway, the narrator just keeps trying his best, and it's so fun. It's like creepy, but not terrifying at this part in the story. And I just wanted to be there. I wanted to be there, like trying to cheer up Roderick and, like doing all these fun activities, like doing music and painting. And it just sounded like the best time ever in the terrifying mansion, of course. And then it actually got chilling. It actually got really scary. Unlike the first things I'd listened to, this one genuinely scared me. The writing was beautiful. It was gorgeous, and it was this is older, way older than the other ones I'd heard, but the writing was just, Edgar Allan Poe, he's Edgar Allan Poe. So yeah, it was really great. I didn't like the ending, I'll say that. I really didn't like the ending, but I think that's largely because I have seen so many horror things that the ending just felt super cliche and super like, yeah, okay, all right, oh that, oh no, you did that, and but this is old, so I kind of think you should let it off the hook a bit. And then finally, my last horror thing that I experienced was after the lottery, I wanted more Shirley Jackson, and I saw, and it just came up in my recommendations, The Haunting of Hill House, which I'd always wanted to read. So here was the perfect chance to listen to it. And the audiobook was incredible. The narrator was brilliant. He did all the voices wonderfully. And the story just surprised me so much, and like in the best way possible. So the story is, it's a typical haunted house setup where you've got one person who's going there to, do a research on paranormal phenomena. He's he's selected two random people who are going to help him, two women, Eleanor and Theo, and like be assistants and like kind of like note the paranormal things, and so he can get their reactions and stuff. And then a fourth person called Luke, who is the heir to the family. He's like, he will own the house one day, and so the family has insisted that someone who is in the family be there during these proceedings, I guess, to make sure nothing nothing illegal, or I don't know, to make sure they're not using it for orgies or something. They talk about orgies a lot at the beginning. Anyway, the thing that's interesting is it feels like an Agatha Christie kind of setup at the beginning. These four people in the house, and you get to know all the characters, and they're all kind of like, excited about something that's going to happen to them, and they don't know what, and we're like, oh, it's going to be something awful, but they're kind of like, no, it's going to be fun, and it's got that kind of fun, adventure-y kind of feeling. The thing that is so interesting about it is that as things start to go awfully, the characters don't really change in very obvious ways, and the way that Shirley Jackson writes it is that in the most scary scenes at night, when there's like banging on the walls and the most freaky things are happening and everyone's nervous, a character will suddenly like crack a joke, and I was just like shocked by this. I was like, what? Like this way that the writer deliberately undercuts the tension. She diffuses the tension so that like you can be with the characters still having their fun sense of camaraderie even while the scary things are happening. I thought this would be like fatal in a horror story, right? Like you need to feel scared, right? But then the reason it works and the reason it's so clever is because you know the reason that the tension is being deflated is because the characters don't want to be scared. They do not want to acknowledge that this is actually a dangerous and scary situation. They want to do what I think a lot of people want to do, is try and just pretend it isn't happening and laugh it off and just keep acting like everything's okay. And of course, as the book goes on, things start to get more and more serious, and every time the tension is undercut, we're reminded, like, oh shit, these guys are not taking this seriously enough. Of course, the reason why people joke when scary things are happening is because they don't want to be scared. So it really gets into the psychology of like how people would react in a haunted house thing. And I thought that was brilliant, and I loved it. And also it was scary. I mean, I've read reviews and people say it's not scary. I found it scary. I think the scary thing is not like what happens in the house, like the banging on the walls or whatever, or the creepy animal that seems to be like circling in the bushes, or the doors that always swing open. What's really scary is the way that the characters keep on denying the scary things. And especially one character whose head we're in a lot, we see how like very naturally her thoughts start to become dangerous, and the other characters don't know that, or at least if they do, then they're ignoring it. So basically, like, we see a person starting to slip into something terrible, and it's done all the way through the novel, and it's done in such subtle and clever ways that it feels like a really natural psychological process rather than something supernatural. So yeah, I don't want to talk too much about like what actually happens, but like just as a reading experience, it was brilliant, and I thought pretty scary. Also, I got really upset at the ending, and I don't see how it could have ended really another way, but it was very abrupt. And yeah, it really hit me hard because, you know, I'm not saying I say what happens, but like, I felt like I wanted it to be an adventure all the way through, because all the characters are trying to make it into a fun kind of Scooby-Doo shenanigans adventure thing. And the more and more it goes on, you're just like, it's not going to be that. It's going to be pretty sad and scary and horrible. But I was really rooting for them, and I wanted to just read about them having fun and making jokes all the time. So when that doesn't pan out, even though I knew it was coming, it really hit me hard. I think that's just because I've not been in a very good place. I wasn't in a very good place in August. That's why the vegetarian made me feel like shit, and that's also why the Moomins made me feel like I just taken ecstasy. So it's like, you know, I was just very emotionally vulnerable in that month, and that obviously impacted my reading. And also the things that I was reading were probably not the best things to read for someone who is in a sort of vulnerable state. But anyway, enough about that. That was my reading for August. I'm planning on continuing the Women in Translation books that I didn't finish. At the beginning of September, I started reading Flights by Olga, I forgot her name. Flights by the Polish Nobel Prize winner, I'll put her name. That was really interesting. I read about 60 pages of it, and it was sort of like this first person, like Bildungsroman, begins as a child and moves into adulthood, and we see the development of a very kind of particular type of consciousness about the world and this interesting personality, but still you're sort of like, where's this going? Where's the story? And then suddenly, boom, it switches to, I think around page 30, to a Polish guy on his holidays, I think in Croatia. He stops the car and his wife and daughter go out to pee somewhere in the bushes, and they never come back. He has to get the police, and the holiday island has now become like a terrifying police procedural kind of thriller thing. And I was like, what's going on? I just thought it was so interesting that I was really involved in the book and enjoying it, and I was 60 pages in, and I still didn't know what the book was about. Some monstrous person reserved it at the library, and so I had to give it back to that person. How dare they take away this book that I've been hoarding? Obviously, I saw this as a sort of declaration of war, and I a few days later, I did it the same thing back, and I reserved it back. So they're going to have to give it back to me, and then if I don't finish it, I'm going to have to give it back to them, and we're just going to have to fight over it until one of us eventually reads this book. I've been reading other things in the meantime, but I'll talk about that later in a later video. Hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about these books. It was a very emotional August, up and down, all over the place. 5-star ratings, no star ratings, because I don't know how to feel about things, and yeah, it was exciting. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.